The slap echoed through the hallway, and for a moment, no one at the Ashford estate breathed. Aaliyah Monroe stood frozen, her cheek burning, her eyes locked on the woman who had just struck her in front of 40 guests. Patricia Ashford's rings had cut into her skin. Champagne glasses paused midair. Somewhere near the piano, a waiter dropped a tray, and the sound of shattering crystal seemed louder than the slap itself. Aaliyah did not cry. She did not raise her hand to her face. She simply looked at Patricia, and in that look was something the older woman had never expected to see from someone she believed was nothing more than her son's assistant. It was not fear. It was pity. Grant Ashford pushed through the crowd, his face pale, his voice cracking as he called his mother's name. But Patricia wasn't listening. She was staring at the ring on Aaliyah's finger, the one Aaliyah had kept hidden under a glove for 3 months, the one that had slipped free when she reached out to steady a toppling centerpiece. An engagement ring, her son's ring, on the hand of the woman she had hired to manage his calendar, drive his car, and disappear the moment her usefulness ended. Patricia's voice shook with a fury that had been building for months, ever since she first noticed how her son looked at this woman. "You will not touch my family's name," she said. Aaliyah only nodded, turned, and walked out into the Charleston night. 3 months earlier, none of this seemed possible. Aaliyah Monroe had taken the job as Grant Ashford's personal assistant because her mother, Denise Monroe, had worked for the Ashford family for over 20 years as their head housekeeper, and the position had simply become available. Aaliyah had a business degree from Spelman College, a resume full of overqualification, and a mother who begged her to take the job anyway, because the pay would cover the mortgage on their small house in North Charleston. Aaliyah told herself it was temporary. She told herself she would not get close to any of them. She had grown up watching her mother clean up after the Ashfords, watching them speak over her, around her, past her, as though she were part of the furniture. Grant Ashford was nothing like his mother. Aaliyah noticed that within the first week. He remembered the names of the waitstaff. He asked Denise about her grandchildren. He apologized when he was running late, instead of expecting Aaliyah to simply absorb the inconvenience. It unsettled her, this decency, because it did not fit the story she had built about people like him her entire life. She fought it. She kept things professional for months, arriving early, leaving without small talk, refusing the coffee he offered her every morning. But decency has a way of wearing down defenses that anger built. By the 4th month, she was laughing at his jokes. By the 6th, she found herself thinking about him after she clocked out. If this story is hitting you right where it should, drop a comment below telling me which character you're rooting for, Aaliyah, Grant, or someone else entirely. And if you haven't yet, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because the second half of this story is where everything changes. Now, back to the Ashford estate. Priya Shaw had been Aaliyah's closest friend since their first year at Spelman, and she was the only person Aaliyah had told about the ring before the world found out the way it did. Priya worked as a paralegal downtown, and it was pure coincidence, or perhaps something closer to fate, that her firm had once handled minor filings for Ashford properties years earlier. When Aaliyah called her in tears the night of the slap, Priya didn't offer comfort first. She offered a question that would change everything. "Has anyone ever looked into how your mom's stake in that company actually ended up gone?" Aaliyah had never thought to ask. Denise never spoke about the early years, about Elias, about anything connected to the company beyond her quiet, dutiful service to it. Priya spent that weekend combing through old public filings, the kind of unglamorous research most people would never think to do, cross-referencing incorporation documents from decades earlier. What she found unsettled her enough to call Aaliyah before sunrise. Ashford Properties' original incorporation papers listed 2 names, not one. Richard Ashford and Aaliyah Monroe. Somewhere between those original filings and the modern version of the company printed in Charleston's business journals, Aaliyah Monroe's name had simply vanished, replaced by language about a prior partnership dissolution, with no supporting documentation attached. Priya knew enough about corporate law to recognize that dissolutions without records were either sloppy paperwork or a very deliberate erasure. She suspected, correctly, that it was the latter. It was Priya who first mentioned Walter Combs, remembering his name from an old real estate case her firm had referenced years earlier. She discovered he had represented several small contractors in Charleston throughout the decades, family-run operations that rarely made headlines, the kind of clients large firms overlooked but who often carried surprisingly airtight paperwork of their own. Priya drove Aaliyah to Walter's office herself, sensing that her friend was too shaken to face what she might learn alone. She sat beside Aaliyah in that waiting room, holding her hand, telling her that whatever the truth turned out to be, it belonged to her either way. Neither of them expected the truth to be quite as large as it was. Richard Ashford had built his real estate empire from a single commercial lot in downtown Charleston 40 years earlier, back when the city was still deciding what kind of place it wanted to become. What most people did not know, and what Richard had spent decades making sure stayed buried, was that he had not built alone. His original partner had been a Black American contractor named Aaliyah Monroe, Denise's late husband and Aaliyah's father. Elias had put up half the capital and done most of the physical labor turning that first lot into something profitable. When Elias died in a construction accident 18 years ago, Richard had quietly bought out the family's stake for a fraction of its worth, using Denise's grief and unfamiliarity with contract law against her. Denise never spoke of it. She simply went to work for the family that had taken what was rightfully hers, because she needed to feed her daughter, and because the lawyers Richard hired made it clear a fight would cost more than she could ever win. Aaliyah did not know any of this until the week after the slap, when she showed up at the small law office of Walter Combs, an old family friend who had drafted the original partnership documents decades earlier and had never stopped feeling guilty about what happened after. Walter had kept a copy of everything, tucked away for years, waiting for a day he wasn't sure would ever come. He slid the folder across his desk and told Aaliyah the truth her mother had carried alone for 18 years. Aaliyah Monroe had never sold his shares. He had only ever signed a limited buyout of profits, not ownership. Legally, Aaliyah and her mother still held a documented claim to nearly half of Ashford Properties, a company now worth well over $200 million. Aaliyah sat in stunned silence as Walter explained it all again, slower this time, because he could see she hadn't fully absorbed it. She thought of her mother scrubbing floors in a house that was rightfully half hers. She thought of every dismissive glance Patricia had ever given Denise, every holiday bonus handed over like charity instead of what it actually was, a fraction of debt owed. She thought of the slap, and for the first time since it happened, anger replaced the pity. Walter warned her that this would not be simple, that the Ashfords had money and lawyers and decades of practice making inconvenient truths disappear. Aaliyah looked at him and said the words that would define the next chapter of her life. Then we make it impossible to ignore. Grant found her that same evening, sitting on the steps of her mother's house, the folder still clutched in her hands. He had been calling for 3 days, and she had ignored everyone. He didn't ask about the ring or the slap first. He asked if she was okay, and something about the simplicity of that question broke through the wall she had been building since Walter's office. She told him everything. She watched his face shift from confusion to disbelief to something that looked almost like shame, though the sin had never been his to carry. He sat with her for hours that night, not defending his parents, not making excuses, just listening, and when he finally spoke, he said one thing that mattered more than any apology could. Whatever you decide to do about this, I'm not on their side. I never was. Patricia Ashford, meanwhile, had launched her own investigation, not into the truth of the Monroe family's claim, but into how to discredit Aaliyah before she could act. She hired a private investigator to dig into Aaliyah's background, hoping to find debt, scandal, anything that could be used as leverage. What the investigator found instead was a spotless record, a woman who had put herself through college while helping support her widowed mother, and absolutely nothing that could be weaponized. Patricia's desperation grew as her options narrowed, and desperation, as it often does, made her reckless. She called an emergency meeting with Richard, and for the first time in their marriage, she saw genuine fear cross her husband's face when she mentioned the name Aaliyah Monroe. Richard had not thought about that name in years. Not really, not in the way that forces a man to reckon with what he did. He remembered Elias as a good man, a hard worker, someone who trusted him completely, which was exactly what had made the deception so easy. He remembered Denise's face the day she signed away rights she didn't fully understand she still held, and the memory made his stomach turn in a way his conscience had successfully avoided for 18 years. When Patricia asked him directly whether the old contracts could resurface, Richard did not answer right away. His silence told her everything. For the first time, Patricia understood that the danger to her family's empire was not the woman she had slapped in that hallway. It was a truth her own husband had buried alive. Denise met Aaliyah Monroe at a church fundraiser in North Charleston when she was 22 years old, working 2 jobs to help her own mother keep their small rental home afloat. Elias was already known around the neighborhood as a young man who could fix anything with his hands, a talent he'd learned from his grandfather, a former shipyard worker who never had the opportunity to build anything of his own. Denise used to say Elias didn't court her so much as he simply kept showing up, fixing the fence at her mother's house, then the porch steps, then eventually admitting he'd been inventing reasons to see her for weeks. They married 2 years later in that same small church, with a reception in the fellowship hall, because neither family could afford anything grander, and neither of them minded at all. In those early years, Elias worked for other men's construction companies, watching contracts go to less skilled builders simply because they had the right last name or the right golf club membership. He used to tell Denise, late at night after long days on other people's job sites, that someday he would build something with his own name on it, something nobody could take credit for but him. When Richard Ashford approached him with a partnership proposal, fresh out of business school and hungry for a foothold in Charleston's real estate market, Elias saw it as the opportunity he had been waiting for his entire working life. Denise remembered him coming home that night, practically glowing, telling her they were finally going to have something that belonged to them. She remembered warning him, gently, to get everything in writing, to have someone independent look over whatever papers Richard put in front of him. Elias, trusting to a fault and eager to finally build the life he'd promised her, waved off her concern, telling her Richard was different, that Richard saw him as an equal, not just hired labor. Denise carried a quiet unease about that partnership for years, one she never spoke aloud because Elias was so proud of what they were building, and because for a while, it genuinely seemed to be working. It wasn't until years after his death, sitting in Walter Combs' office listening to her own daughter read that old letter aloud, that Denise finally understood her instincts had been right all along, and that the cost of ignoring them had been higher than she ever imagined. Denise met Aaliyah Monroe at a church revival in North Charleston when she was only 22, working double shifts at a diner to help her own mother with rent while dreaming, in the quiet way young people do, of something more permanent than survival. Elias had noticed her long before he worked up the nerve to speak to her, and when he finally did, he didn't offer flattery. He offered a plan. He told her he intended to build something of his own one day, not just work construction for someone else's name on the sign. And he asked, almost shyly, if she'd consider building a life alongside a man chasing something that ambitious. Denise laughed at the boldness of it, but she said yes anyway, sensing in him a steadiness she hadn't found in anyone else. Their early marriage was defined by long hours and short money. Elias working sunup to sundown on other men's job sites while quietly saving toward tools and a truck of his own. Denise remembered the night he came home practically vibrating with excitement, describing a young white businessman fresh out of school named Richard Ashford who had approached him after watching him run a crew more efficiently than any foreman on the site. Richard had talked about vision and growth and equal partnership, words that sounded, to a young black tradesman in that era, almost too good to be real. Elias wanted to believe them anyway, because believing them meant believing in a future where his family would never again have to count every dollar twice before spending it. Aaliyah was born 2 years into that partnership, and Elias used to tell Denise, half joking, that their daughter would grow up owning half of something real, something with his name on it, something no one could ever quietly take away. Denise held on to that memory tightly in the years after his death, turning it over and over, wondering if he had sensed even then how fragile that promise truly was. When Walter Combs finally showed Aaliyah her father's letter, the tone of it, warm, plain-spoken, quietly proud, matched exactly the man Denise had described to her daughter 1,000 times growing up. It was, in its own way, Elias speaking to his family one final time from a distance of nearly 2 decades at the exact moment they needed to hear him most. 40 years earlier, Aaliyah Monroe had been the most sought-after young contractor in North Charleston. Known for finishing jobs early and never cutting corners on materials, a reputation that took him years of underpaid labor to build in an industry that rarely gave black tradesmen credit for their own expertise. Richard Ashford, fresh out of business school with more ambition than capital, had approached Elias with a simple proposition. Richard would handle financing and client relationships, and Elias would handle construction and oversight, splitting ownership of whatever they built together 50-50. On paper, it was a partnership of equals. In practice, Richard's name went on every public document, every permit, every ribbon-cutting photograph, while Elias worked the sites and coveralls, invisible to the very city officials who approved the buildings he built. Elias never complained about the imbalance, believing, as many hard-working men of his generation were taught to believe, that the ownership on paper mattered more than the recognition in public. Denise remembered those early years fondly despite the exhaustion, remembered Elias coming home covered in drywall dust, exhausted but proud, talking about the day their names would both be on the building downtown. That day never came. Richard, whether through cowardice or convenience, always found a reason to delay adding Elias's name to public materials, promising it would happen once the company stabilized, once the next deal closed, once there was less risk and visibility. The stability never arrived at a time that suited Richard's comfort, and eventually, the promise simply stopped being mentioned at all. The construction accident that killed Elias happened on a site Richard had personally cleared for safety inspection 2 days earlier, a detail that haunted Richard more than he ever admitted to anyone, including Patricia. In the chaotic weeks following Elias's death, grieving and caring for a young Aaliyah alone, Denise had been presented with paperwork by Richard's lawyers describing a temporary profit adjustment she was told was standard procedure to keep the company operating smoothly during the transition. She signed it without a lawyer of her own present, trusting a family she had known for years, never realizing the document redefined her husband's equity as a limited, expiring interest rather than permanent ownership. Richard knew exactly what that paperwork did. He let it happen anyway, telling himself it was simpler for everyone involved. The lawsuit filing hit local Charleston news before Aaliyah had even finished her morning coffee. Walter Combs had moved quickly and carefully, filing not just a claim for ownership, but a demand for a full financial audit of Ashford properties going back 2 decades. Reporters who had spent years covering Richard Ashford as a pillar of the community suddenly had a very different story to tell, one involving a black contractor's stolen legacy and a housekeeper who had spent nearly 2 decades unknowingly working for a company that was half her own. The story spread fast, not because it was scandalous in the way tabloids usually crave, but because it was true, documented, and deeply, quietly devastating in a way people couldn't look away from. Denise Monroe found out about the lawsuit from a neighbor before her own daughter had the chance to explain it gently. She came home to find her small living room full of reporters' voicemails and her hands shaking as she called Aaliyah, not with anger, but with a grief that had been suppressed for 18 years finally breaking the surface. She had spent almost 2 decades believing she had failed her husband's memory by accepting so little for so much labor and sacrifice. Aaliyah drove straight to her mother's house, holding her while she cried for the first time in years, not for what was lost, but for the possibility that it might finally be recognized. "Your father built that company with his hands," Denise whispered. "I just didn't know how to fight for what he built." Grant made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He hired his own attorney, separate from his family's legal team, and publicly stated that he supported a full and transparent audit of Ashford properties. His father called it betrayal. His mother refused to speak to him for a week. But Grant had spent the last month watching his family's carefully built image crumble under the weight of a truth they should have made right decades earlier. And he refused to be complicit in covering it up any longer, especially not when the woman standing on the other side of that truth was someone he loved. At a family dinner that turned into a shouting match, Grant told his parents plainly that he would rather lose his inheritance than lose his integrity. And for once, Richard had no argument prepared. This is the part of the story where the truth starts fighting back. And trust me, it only gets bigger from here. If you're new to this channel, welcome, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss how this ends. Drop a like if you think Aaliyah deserves everything that's coming to her. Let's keep going. The court proceedings stretched across 4 tense months, during which Ashford Properties' stock value, though privately held, saw its lending relationship strained as banks grew cautious about the unresolved ownership dispute. Richard's legal team fought hard, arguing the original buyout agreement, however informal, represented Aaliyah Monroe's intent to relinquish ownership. But Walter Combs had one advantage Richard hadn't accounted for: a signed letter from Aaliyah himself, written just weeks before his death, explicitly stating he had only agreed to a temporary profit-sharing adjustment while he recovered from an earlier injury, never a permanent sale of his shares. Richard had known that letter existed. He had simply hoped it had been lost to time, the way so many other inconvenient truths had been. The letter changed everything, but it did not end the fight quietly. Richard's attorneys immediately challenged its authenticity, calling in a handwriting expert who testified that 18 years of storage could degrade ink samples enough to make dating unreliable. Walter had anticipated this. He called his own expert, a retired document examiner who had worked with the Charleston County court system for over 30 years, who testified plainly that the letter's paper stock matched other verified Aaliyah Monroe correspondence from the same period. Correspondence Denise had kept in a cedar box for sentimental reasons no one had ever thought to question. The judge allowed the letter into evidence, and the courtroom fell into a silence that felt heavier with every passing second. Then came a moment no one expected. Richard's own longtime bookkeeper, a woman named Carol Whitfield who had worked for Ashford Properties for over 25 years, requested to testify voluntarily against her own attorney's advice. She told the court that she had always known the ownership structure looked unusual, that profit distributions had quietly excluded a line item labeled Only M settlement for years, a line item she had never been permitted to ask about. Her testimony did not accuse Richard directly, but confirmed the pattern Walter had been building for months, a slow, deliberate erasure carried out not through one dramatic act, but through years of small, quiet omissions that added up to something enormous. Richard sat motionless throughout her testimony, staring at the table in front of him. Grant testified as well, not for his family, but for the truth as he understood it. He described the night Aaliyah told him everything, the folder in her shaking hands, the years of dismissiveness his mother had shown Denise that he'd never fully registered until he saw it framed as what it truly was. His testimony was not dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and devastating in its simplicity, a son publicly acknowledging what his family had done while his mother watched from the gallery, her face unreadable. When the defense attorney asked Grant whether testifying against his own family's interests troubled him, Grant answered without hesitation, "What troubles me is that it took this long for any of us to tell the truth." When it was read aloud in full, Denise wept quietly in the gallery, and Aaliyah reached for her mother's hand, holding it tightly as the weight of 18 years began, finally, to lift. The judge ruled that the Monroe family retained a legitimate 45% stake in Ashford Properties, along with backdated compensation for profits withheld over nearly 2 decades, a sum that would ultimately total in the tens of millions. Richard's public image, once untouchable in Charleston social circles, was permanently altered. Patricia, who had spent the trial insisting she had done nothing wrong, found herself increasingly isolated as even her closest friends began quietly distancing themselves from the scandal attached to the Ashford name. Patricia's unraveling did not happen all at once. It happened in the small moments after the ruling, in the way invitations to charity boards quietly stopped arriving, in the way old friends suddenly had scheduling conflicts whenever her name came up. She blamed everyone but herself, insisting that Aaliyah had somehow orchestrated all of it from the beginning, seducing her son as part of a long con to steal what she believed her family had earned fairly. It was Richard, surprisingly, who finally stopped her from saying this publicly. In one of the only moments of genuine honesty in their entire marriage, he told her the truth he had avoided for 18 years. We didn't earn all of it, Patricia. Not the way we told ourselves we did. Aaliyah did not celebrate the ruling the way people expected her to. There was no triumphant press conference, no gloating statement to the cameras waiting outside the courthouse. She simply took her mother home, made her a cup of tea, and sat with her on the porch where Denise had spent so many quiet evenings after long days working in a house that was never truly someone else's alone. We don't have to prove anything to them anymore, Aaliyah told her mother. We just have to build what Dad started, the right way this time. Denise smiled for the first time in what felt like months. And for the first time since Elias's death, she allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't require survival as its only ambition. Grant proposed again 3 weeks after the ruling, this time with no hidden ring, no secrecy, no fear of what his parents might say. He asked Aaliyah on the same porch where she had once sat holding her mother, in front of Denise, in front of Priya, in front of the life Aaliyah had actually built rather than the one anyone had assigned her. Aaliyah said yes, not because anything had been resolved between his family and hers, but because she had learned, over these difficult months, exactly who Grant was when everything he thought he knew about his own family fell apart. He had chosen honesty over comfort, and to Aaliyah, that mattered more than any name or fortune ever could. 2 nights before the verdict came down, Grant drove to his father's office alone, long after the staff had gone home, because he needed one conversation that had nothing to do with lawyers or strategy. He found Richard sitting in the dark, a single desk lamp illuminating old photographs he had pulled from a locked drawer, photographs of a younger Richard standing beside a younger Aaliyah Monroe on a half-finished construction site, both men laughing at something the camera never captured. Grant had never seen these photographs before. His father had spent 30 years making sure he never would. Richard did not try to hide them when Grant walked in. Something in him, worn down by months of legal battles and a marriage fraying at its edges, no longer had the energy to keep pretending. Grant asked the only question that mattered to him in that moment. Had his father ever actually cared about Aaliyah Monroe, or had the partnership only ever been a transaction dressed up as friendship? Richard was quiet for a long time before answering, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a rawness Grant had never heard from him before. He said he had cared about Aaliyah more than almost anyone in his life, which was exactly what made what he did afterwards so difficult to live with. He said grief and fear had made him a coward in the weeks after the accident, and that cowardice, left unaddressed for years, had calcified into something closer to willful blindness. I told myself Denise was fine, Richard said. I told myself that because it let me stop thinking about what I owed her. It was not an excuse, and Richard did not offer it as one. Grant sat with his father in that dim office for over an hour, hearing, for the first time, the full weight of decisions made decades before he was even born, decisions that had shaped his entire understanding of his family's success. He told his father plainly that he intended to keep supporting Aaliyah and Denise through whatever came next, regardless of what it cost the family financially or socially. Richard nodded, and for once, offered no resistance. I know, he said. I think some part of me has been waiting for someone in this family to finally do the right thing without being forced into it. Grant left that office understanding his father differently, not forgiving him entirely, but no longer seeing him only as a villain in his fiancée's story. That conversation did not repair everything between them, but it planted something neither man expected. In the months following the ruling, Richard began quietly funding scholarship programs for young black tradespeople across Charleston, working construction apprenticeships modeled loosely on the opportunities he once promised Aaliyah and never fully delivered. He never publicized these efforts, and when Aaliyah eventually learned of them through a mutual acquaintance rather than from Richard himself, she recognized it for what it was, not a public relations maneuver, but a private, overdue attempt at making something right that could never be fully undone. She did not offer him forgiveness either, not yet, but she allowed herself to notice the effort, which was more than she ever expected to give him. 6 months later, Ashford Properties was restructured under new leadership, with Aaliyah taking a board seat representing her family's restored stake, working alongside Grant, who had stepped into a role focused on community development projects across Charleston's historically underserved neighborhoods, a quiet but deliberate effort to repair some of what his family's history had cost. Richard, humbled but still present, remained involved as an advisor, though the company he once controlled unilaterally now operated with the kind of transparency that would have been unthinkable to him a year earlier. Patricia largely withdrew from public life, choosing instead to focus on repairing what remained of her relationship with her son, a slow process built one uncomfortable, honest conversation at a time. Patricia's withdrawal from Charleston society was not the graceful retreat she tried to present it as. In private, she spent weeks refusing to leave the house, replaying the slap in her mind on a loop she couldn't silence. Not out of guilt for striking Aaliyah, at first, but out of humiliation that had been witnessed by 40 of the people whose opinions had defined her entire adult life. It took months and a difficult conversation with Grant that nearly ended in him walking out permanently, before Patricia allowed herself to sit with the actual weight of what she'd done rather than the embarrassment of being seen doing it. Grant told her plainly that the slap wasn't the real crime, that the real crime had been 18 years of a family building a fortune on top of a woman's grief, and Patricia, for the first time in her life, had no rehearsed response ready. She began, slowly and without any public announcement, showing up at the Aaliyah Monroe Center on days she knew Denise would be there, not to seek forgiveness she hadn't earned, but simply to help, folding donated clothing, sorting paperwork for job training applicants, doing quiet, unglamorous work that no camera would ever capture. Denise did not warm to her quickly, and Patricia never once asked her to. The two women existed in careful, mostly silent proximity for months, two people who had lived on opposite sides of the same injustice for 2 decades, slowly learning what it looked like to simply occupy the same room, without pretense. It was, Aaliyah later said, the closest thing to an apology her mother would ever accept, action offered quietly instead of words demanded loudly. Denise Monroe never went back to cleaning another family's home again. Instead, she used a portion of the settlement to open a small community center in North Charleston, offering job training and financial literacy classes to families who, like hers had once been, were unaware of the rights and protections available to them. She named it after her late husband, calling it the Aaliyah Monroe Center, a tribute not to loss, but to what he had built and what could still grow from it. On opening day, she stood at the entrance greeting neighbors, contractors, and former co-workers who had once seen her only as the Ashford housekeeper. And for the first time in nearly 2 decades, she introduced herself simply as Denise Monroe, no title required. Priya stood beside Aaliyah through every hearing, every sleepless night of preparation. And when the ruling finally came down, it was Priya who cried first, right there in the courthouse hallway, overwhelmed by a fight she had started with a single question months earlier. She eventually left her paralegal position to join Walter Combs' practice full-time, telling him she wanted to spend her career helping other families uncover the kind of quiet injustices that so rarely made headlines but shaped entire lifetimes. Walter, well into his 60s by then, told her it would be an honor to mentor someone who had proven, before she even had the degree, that she already had the instincts for it. Aaliyah often said afterward that the truth had needed 2 people to bring it into the light, her own courage and Priya's refusal to let a hard question go unasked. Aaliyah married Grant the following spring in a small ceremony at that same community center, surrounded by people from both sides of a divide that had once seemed impossible to cross. There was no attempt to erase the pain of what had happened, no pretending the years of quiet injustice hadn't shaped every person standing in that room. But there was something else present too, something that felt like the beginning of an honest reckoning rather than another buried secret. As Aaliyah looked out at her mother, radiant and finally at peace, she understood that the slap that once echoed through the Ashford estate hallway had not been the end of her story. It had been the exact moment the truth finally refused to stay silent any longer. Patricia Ashford did not change overnight, and the story would be dishonest if it pretended otherwise. For weeks after the ruling, she remained convinced that she was the true victim of the entire ordeal, a woman whose family's reputation had been destroyed by circumstances that predated her marriage entirely. It was a conversation with her own sister, visiting from Savannah for the first time in over a year, that finally cracked something open in her. Her sister asked her plainly, without any of the social softening Patricia was used to, whether she had ever once in 18 years wondered why Denise Monroe seemed to carry a sadness she never explained. Patricia realized, sitting with that question, that she had never wondered at all. She had simply never thought to ask. That admission led Patricia to do something she had never done in the 2 decades Denise worked in her home. She asked to speak with her directly, without lawyers, without an audience, just the two of them in the same kitchen where Denise had once served her family thousands of meals. It was an uncomfortable, halting conversation, full of long pauses and unfinished sentences, but Patricia said the words she should have said years earlier. She apologized, not for the lawsuit or the settlement, but for never once seeing Denise as anything other than staff, for mistaking her dignity and silence for contentment. Denise did not offer easy forgiveness. She simply said, "I appreciate you finally asking," and left it there, which was in its own way exactly the kind of honesty the moment required. Patricia's relationship with Aaliyah remained distant for much longer, understandably so, given the slap that had started all of it. But she attended the wedding, seated quietly near the back, and afterwards sent a short, handwritten note to Aaliyah rather than a card purchased for the occasion. It read simply that she hoped, in time, to be the kind of mother-in-law her son's wife deserved, and that she understood that hope alone did not erase what had already been done. Aaliyah kept the note in a drawer, not because she was ready to forgive completely, but because she recognized, even in her own hard-won position of strength, that people were capable of change when finally forced to confront the truth about themselves. If this story moved you, that's exactly why I make these, because everyone deserves to see the moment the truth finally wins. Subscribe if you haven't already, hit that notification bell, and tell me in the comments, what would you have done in Aaliyah's position? I read every single comment, and I've got another story just like this one dropping soon. Until then, take care of yourselves, and remember, the truth always comes out.